funding of passenger rails. Thank you for the funding of passenger rail. And we are working to make sure that Ohio gets our share of those funds. So the Whistle Stop has been an opportunity for us to talk about the Corridor ID program specifically, which is designed for intercity rail. So things like the services we'd like to see connecting the cities in Ohio. Typically cities that are more than 50 and less than 750 miles apart by the U.S. federal definition. And so the Corridor ID program is our opportunity for substantial federal funding. And of course, there is a program and a process to all of this. So we start with making a plan, and then we get the detailed plan, and then we get into it. And each phase requires a little bit more funding from state and local entities. And so what we have spent a lot of our time focusing on from advocacy is making sure that we're ready for that, and we're ready for the local matches that are going to be required, and we're advocating for those things. So this Whistle Stop, we have done them mostly at the regional planning organizations. So we've had it in Columbus and Cincinnati, in Dayton. We've had one up here in Cleveland, where I'm based at NOACA. We had it in Northwest Ohio at Toledo, and we've also had events in Lima, and in fact, Crestline was our best attended of any of the events, with 400 people from the area, from that North Central Ohio area, coming and learning about this process. So we'll talk about, we wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to see that. So we had always intended to do this as a Zoom meeting at some point, but of course, for anybody that could attend in person, we were hoping to get those done first. But today's our opportunity to share that in a Zoom format. So we'll talk through the Corridor ID program, and then we'll also talk through the economic impact study that All Aboard Ohio commissioned, thanks to the support of the Columbus Foundation, that talks about the anticipated economic impact if the Ohio 3C and D is executed. So 3C and D being Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati, something we're all very excited for here. So I'll get into a little bit of kickoff, and then John Esterly, one of our board members, is going to be doing the bulk of the presentation here, and we look forward to your questions. I will do my best to keep up with questions as they come through in the chat. I'm also driving the PowerPoint, so forgive me if I can't be right on top of every one of them. And we are, excited to have you here joining us. And so for the people that are just coming in, as I apologize, I see that admit all now, but you'll be able to catch on quick here. Okay, so I will go ahead and share this. And I did also add in here, John, just so you're aware, a quick summary of upcoming chapter events so that people can see that as well. So just you'll see that extra slide in here. Hopefully I got all the links correct. I was doing that a little bit quickly. Okay, I want to save this screen. So if somebody who is on video wouldn't mind just giving me a thumbs up if you can see that screen. Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate that. All right, and then that's what we have. So John, do you want to talk through this, and I'll drive here?
Absolutely. So again, welcome everybody. Thank you so much, Brian, for the wonderful introduction. Appreciate you all carving out some time on a Saturday morning. I gave a very similar presentation yesterday for the 33 corridor group. So hopefully I'm a little bit more in practice, since it's been a while since we've had our last Whistle Stop tour in person. But we'll get started here, Brian, if you want to click to the kind of the overview slide. So we're going to talk about 5 things today, or really 4 things, and then open the floor for question. We're going to give a little background about who we are and why we're here. We're going to talk about the Corridor ID program itself, where we're at in that process, and then we're going to give a very high-level overview for the economic impact study that we commissioned. Since this is statewide, we're going to focus on statewide numbers, and as a caveat, this is only the 3CD corridor. So for folks that are not along that corridor, those numbers won't necessarily apply to a corridor that might be in your backyard, but we would expect to see very similar numbers along all of the new proposed routes. All right, so we are All Aboard Ohio, and we'll just click right on to the next slide here that kind of has more of the nuts and bolts of who we are. So we are a 50-year-old advocacy group here in Ohio. We do act as Ohio's representative to the National Passenger Rail Association. We advocate for the expansion of passenger rail throughout the state, not only in terms of new routes like we'll talk about today, but also increased or enhanced service along the routes that already exist across the northern and southern parts of the state. One thing that was brought up in the meeting yesterday is if you take a look at the date, we were founded very shortly after the founding of Amtrak. So we've really been a voice throughout the whole Amtrak period, and hope to continue to see expanded coverage there. So what we do, again, we advocate for robust transportation systems. So not only passenger rail, but we're also very mindful that that first and last mile service with local transit agencies is a big piece of the overall transit puzzle. So we work very closely with places like the Greater Cleveland RTA, with TARTA in the Toledo area, with COTA here in Central Ohio, and with the Cincinnati RTA as well. So not just passenger rail, but that is where our primary focus is. We also work on building coalitions between all of the different stakeholders to make sure that everybody's got all the information that they need and are able to advocate on their own, for our overall goal of increased passenger rail service. And then again, how we do it, we are funded through membership, donations, and grants. Most of our funding comes through the latter two, donations and grants. We would appreciate anybody who would want to become a member, and anybody who's interested in making a donation. It's what helps keep the wheels turning, as it were. We do have 4 active chapters, basically along the 3C corridor, the big cities, and then also in the Northwest Ohio, Toledo area. We do these statewide Zoom meetings every month. So if this is something that you're enjoying, getting this type of information, please feel free to sign up for the newsletter so that you know when the next one is going to be. We do different topics every month. And then we also do a statewide passenger rail coalition where we bring, again, the stakeholders along these various routes into the same room so that we can make good policy decisions as a group, so that we don't end up with 2 different stakeholders, working against one another.
And then I'll talk to this one, John. So this is the summary of our upcoming chapter events. So the next statewide Zoom meeting will be 1 month. We do these on the second Saturday of the month. All of these are listed on the allaboardohio.org webpage. So if you go to the events link at the top there, you'll see a calendar with all these upcoming events. But just to make sure you're aware of it, we do have a couple of chapter meetings next weekend. So for those of you in Northeast Ohio, we'll be at the downtown Cleveland Public Library early in the afternoon next Saturday, and then the central group next Saturday will also have their chapter meeting. I apologize, I didn't get a chance to add that link in there, but it's on the event page. For those of you in Northeast Ohio, we've had the opportunity to arrange a visit to the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad maintenance facility in Brecksville there, right by the river. So if any of you are interested in that, that's going to be in June. Sorry, that is June 15th. So Saturday in June at 11 o'clock. There is a link there to that event if you're interested. The Northwest chapter will be participating in the Train Day, the Toledo Train Day events on Friday, May 10th. And then the next Southwest chapter meeting is Wednesday, April 24th at their regular place. And as Mitch mentioned, the Southwest chapter is en route to Chicago right now just to experience the Cardinal to and from between Cincinnati and Chicago. So those are some of our upcoming events, and feel free to ask questions in the chat if you're curious more about that.
All right, so we'll jump right into the corridor ID program. As Brian had mentioned, this all came from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed several years ago. It is a completely new program. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today, we're kind of through the looking glass here, friends. This is step 1, round 1 of a very new program. So we're going to talk very high level about how some of this is supposed to work, but we don't really have anything to compare it to as of yet. So what are the goals of this corridor ID program? Well, it's to identify underserved locations throughout the country including, as a Central Ohio resident, I'd like to throw my hand up and say, Columbus being the largest metropolitan area without rail service, we're delighted to see as many nods as we've gotten here. But also looking at areas where the service is maybe not up to where we'd like to see it. So it identifies these new routes. It gives a very structured, methodical approach to working through funding, not only of the studies, but also of the final implementation. And then really gives stakeholders and sponsors an opportunity to make informed decisions. So we can go to that next slide there, Brian. We look at this as kind of 6 overarching steps. The Corridor ID program is broken up into 3 steps, and most of those steps are planning in the Corridor ID program. The bulk of the construction will fall under the implementation stages, and then ongoing operation is going to be handled, hopefully by Amtrak, but potentially by another operator. So we look at 3 different kind of buckets of potential corridors. The first would be improvements to existing service. So we've got service that maybe lacks a little bit in terms of either timing or frequency. We can look at extensions to existing service where maybe we've got a demand for service that's just beyond the current scope of the existing route. And then we've got entirely new service where there's just no passenger rail service whatsoever. And we are looking at implementing a completely new line. And as a preview of coming attractions, we were afforded 1 or more of each of these groups in our Corridor ID allotments last December. So how does the program work? We'll jump into the first slide here. Ohio was awarded 4 different routes in the Corridor ID program. The first, which is the one that we have our economic impact numbers on, is the Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati, or 3CD route. The local sponsor of that is the state of Ohio, being managed by the ORDC, or Ohio Rail Development Commission. The second is Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit. That one is also sponsored by the state. Third, we've got the Cleveland, Fort Wayne, Lima, Pittsburgh, Columbus route, also known as Midwest Connect. This is sponsored by the city of Fort Wayne with administrative support from MORPC, which is Central Ohio's MPO. And then finally, we've got increased service for the Daily Cardinal between New York and Chicago. So that the route that goes through Cincinnati, I believe right now it's running 3 days a week. We're looking at increased service, not only in terms of frequency, but also in terms of potential new stops along the route. So first 2, or rather the 2 that involve Columbus are both entirely new service. Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, I would argue, is an extension of existing service. We've got existing service between Cleveland and Toledo. We're just looking at adding that last leg between Toledo and Detroit. And then finally, just increased service or, better service along that Cardinal route in the southern portion of the state. So the Corridor ID program, again, is broken up into 3 steps. Right now, we are in step 1 for all 4 of the routes that we just talked about. Step 1 is completely funded by the federal government. It's what's called the scoping, or determining the scope of the project. So basically what we're doing here is the plan for the plan. We will figure out how much the rest of the development program will cost, the rest of the studies. And again, all 4 of these routes are approved. They are funded as of right now. Some of you folks that are following closely may have seen that MORPC put out their request for proposal for folks to handle step 1 for them. I expect to see one from ORDC very soon for the 2 state-sponsored routes. So this is, again, we're at the very beginning of this process. So step 2, this is where a lot of the meat and potatoes of the design is going to come. This is where we make decisions about, for example, which existing passenger lines we might be able to use, or existing freight lines, rather, we'd be able to use to develop the new routes. If there is any additional infrastructure that would need to be added, that's where this will be decided. Also, for folks that don't have a city with a name in the name of a route, this is where you would want to advocate for your town to be, a part of the plan. And then also we'll make some decisions about ongoing operations. There is a 10% local match required here. We're not really sure what that number is going to be. That will be determined during step one. But the bulk of this funding still comes from that bipartisan infrastructure fund. And then finally, step three is the final environmental and engineering analysis. So this is where we'll figure out exactly how much the capital construction will be. There is a 20% local match. Again, 80% comes from the federal government, again, funded through the bipartisan infrastructure fund. So to answer a question that comes up pretty frequently, at least the planning portion of this project is completely funded as of right now. This all comes from those dollars. So there's really no need for, additional funding to come from the government. It is already allocated. Step three is, again, where we get kind of the final estimate as to what it's going to cost when we put shovels in the ground. What I'd like to point out again for the folks that might be policymakers on the call is we pulled down a substantial amount of federal dollars with a very small amount of local match. So again, we're able to leverage our local dollars to really get a lot of good information and make good informed decisions. So this just kind of talks specifically about step two. Again, if a lot of the questions that we may have as it comes up about ongoing operations or even potential stops, you'll find that our answer is very often that's a step two decision. That is really where the meat and potatoes are done. So again, things like the actual route, things like where the stops are going to be, even things like how many trains we would run in a given day and where those trains are going to start and stop their route throughout the course of the day. So if you are in a position where you are advocating specifically for one of those things, whether it be a stop in your town or whether it be a certain level of frequency, step two is where that advocacy would want to happen. So we'll be sure to share the slide deck, so don't feel like you have to whip this down really quick. But these are some links and some emails that we've got, mostly from FRA, who's the sponsor of the Corridor ID program. They have a number of webinars that have been recorded from the past several years as this program has been developed. So if you're really interested in the nuts and bolts of how this is going to go forward, I would certainly recommend that you spend some time watching these. They do lay out quite a bit of information about how that would work. So we will shift gears here slightly and talk about our economic impact study. So this is, again, going to be statewide numbers. We're not really going to focus in on any particular region as we've done along the way as we've done our Whistle Stop tour, but really, again, focus in on the statewide numbers. So our economic impact study was funded through a grant from the Columbus Foundation. Thank you again to the Columbus Foundation for being great partners for this study. We did choose to do what we feel is probably the most interesting of the routes. And also it does include Columbus, and it helped with the grant application to have them included. It was performed by Scioto Analysis, which is a local policy firm here in Columbus. They do a lot of environmental and social impact studies, so they were a great partner as well. And we look primarily at the economic impact of kind of first level development. So things like actual construction of not only the stations, but the upgrades to the tracks, but also operations as they're ongoing. The one thing that we don't really look at is what I would term as secondary economic impact, things like changes in the hospitality industry, increased real estate values, the businesses that are built up around train stations. So for example, the Starbucks that's in the train station lobby, those are not really factored into this economic impact study. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the scope would be. So this handsome man here is Rob Moore. He's with Scioto Analysis. He was the principal, and he's the one that we work directly with. Again, they've been great partners. We look to work with them in the future on additional studies. that may be different in scope, either looking at the same route, but maybe some different information, or on different routes, or on maybe policy positions that are more global in terms of funding and things along those lines. So again, just a note on where these numbers came from. We took actual ridership numbers from existing stations in Ohio. And as anybody who has traveled by Amtrak or even investigated traveling by Amtrak in Ohio knows, we don't really have convenient times to get to the stations in terms of getting on a train to go either east or west out of any of our major hubs in Ohio. So we've got fairly conservative ridership numbers that these estimates were based on. Some of the other values were taken from the 2007 ORDC Ohio Hub study, and then, obviously adjusted for inflation in a post-pandemic world. So here's the exciting stuff, and I won't read it to you, but just to give you some of the highlights, we're looking at an initial build-out contribution to GSP of over $100 million. Ongoing contribution of $25 to $47 million. We're going to add over 1,000 jobs, and we're going to generate, approximately $65 million in new ongoing wages. This gives you an idea of how that economic impact breaks out by region. So Cleveland, Elyria, kind of that northeast chunk of the state. Greater Columbus, just for the purposes of these numbers, that does include both Delaware and Crestline. The greater Dayton area would include a stop in Springfield, as is part of the Amtrak Connect Us plan. And then the Cincinnati area would include not only Cincinnati, but also a potential stop outside the city, whether that be Hamilton, Sharonville, or other. So I know I saw some folks on the call that come from the building trades or labor community. I appreciate you folks being here with us today. I would like to point out that as we look at these total economic impact numbers, the number one source of economic impact is in that construction field, which should be a surprise to no one on this call. We're going to be undertaking pretty substantial construction projects throughout the state to support whatever Amtrak or passenger rail expansion we're able to see here. So many of the places that we're looking at either have under capacity stations, or they have stations that don't exist yet. So we're going to have a lot of building construction. We'll have a lot of supportive construction, and we'll have a lot of engineering along the route to upgrade the tracks to support higher speeds. Some of the other things that we're going to see an impact on are really more directly tied to that construction. Things like rental and leasing in the real estate realm. If we've got a bunch of new folks coming into town to help build something, they're going to need a place to stay. They're going to need places to eat. So that's where a lot of this supportive economic impact comes from. And then as we look at ongoing economic impact, when you build a giant train system, it should be no surprise that we have a lot of transportation economic impact as a result of that. So that's where we see a lot of that money coming back into the state, is through the actual operation of the route. Again, we're going to see, to a lesser extent, some other industries that are impacted in a positive way. So I kind of highlighted it when we were talking about Scioto analysis, but we are looking at doing some other studies with them that maybe focus a little bit more on the social impact of things, looking at automotive miles not traveled and how that will help with things like reduced emissions, reduced requirements on maintenance for our road systems, looking at statewide and local reductions in traffic injuries and fatalities. So again, that human factor there. Looking at that secondary impact on property values, hospitality, the restaurant industry, all of the things that you would see build up around a transit hub, and then the development of local stations. Now, the one thing that isn't on this list that is probably the next study that we look at is operational funding, and how other states do it, and how Ohio can maybe plan to do it going forward, because that's one of the biggest questions that our legislature has, is how we're going to fund all of this. And that's it. So, we would certainly welcome any questions that you've had, just because there are a number of folks on the Zoom. just to kind of maintain some semblance of order, I'd ask that you raise your hand and we'll kind of go right through and answer those questions. And then Brian, if you see any in the chat that would need immediate response, feel free to direct me towards those. I'm kind of trying to watch everything at once, but I've only got two eyes. So
It's hard. It's hard. I've got three screens and I can't keep up with it. Looks like Jeffrey Strasser's got his hand up. So I will go ahead and call on you, sir.
I'm curious about a stop maybe in Dublin, Ohio, where I live.
That's a great question, Jeffrey. The meeting that I was at yesterday and gave this very similar presentation is a group called the 33 Corridor Group, which includes, obviously Dublin and in your neck of the woods, and then a number of other municipalities going up through Union County to Marysville. They are very interested in it, but again, that's going to be something that's going to be determined during step 2 of the process. Your town would follow along MORPS's Midwest Connect plan. So we would want to work closely with MORPS and with the city of Fort Wayne to make sure that they know that Dublin definitely has an interest in having it there. But I would say, and I don't want to speak out of turn, Dublin had a pretty big presence at the meeting yesterday, and they do have some plans behind the scenes to, continue to advocate for a stop there.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on it, I know a lot of us kind of live in the train advocacy and very familiar with it, but to kind of take one step back, service between Columbus and Lima that would be ongoing to Fort Wayne and Chicago would go through Dublin. So when we talk about that Midwest Connect route, and just to kind of clarify, like a service that's going to Cleveland would not be going through Dublin, but a service that's going to the Northwest could potentially. But Dublin's done a great job of planning for it if that route comes together, and would be in a good position to make that request. So thank you for the question, Jeff. Glenn, let's go ahead and have your question.
Yeah, John, how you doing?
Good. Glad to see my friends from NOPRA on today.
Yeah. Hey, listen, I'm sure you're aware of the FRA's new grant program, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement, that they just rolled out. And we had a discussion about this yesterday at the Northwest All Aboard Ohio meeting. And the question was this: they had a lot of eligible projects listing, and I wanted to hone it down on one project that we could use between Cleveland and Toledo. And what do you think should be our major focus if we were to go after this grant money? What do you think our major focus should be in order to improve rail structure between us?
Absolutely. So when you look at that particular chunk of the route, whether it be Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, or whether that be either of the existing routes traveling, between Chicago and points east that pass through there, the two choke points, as have been identified to me, are both bridges. One is right there in your neck of the woods, the Maumee River Bridge. And then the second one goes over the Sandusky Bay. So if someone were to advocate for Chrissy grant money, those would probably be the two things that I would lean into there. So just for the sake of everybody on the call, those dollars are traditionally identified for freight use, but that doesn't necessarily completely exclude passenger rail from reaching into that bucket, particularly if it's something that would benefit both passenger and freight. And in both cases of these bridges, it certainly will. So I know they've changed the program slightly here, and the requirements have gone up, not necessarily in terms of local match dollars, but the grant dollars are much higher than they've been in previous years. So to be competitive, you really do need to be looking at large projects. So things like tunnels, bridges, major infrastructure upgrades versus just, hey, we need to upgrade 10 miles of track, so we're going to draw down these Chrissy dollars. So, Glenn, to your point, looking at things like bridges and choke points is probably going to be where those dollars end up. So good thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Great question in the chat here, John, and the one we always get. So Ben Keith asked, what year can we expect to see passenger rail service begin in Columbus?
So that's a great question. I'm going to answer it in two different ways, but the answer is going to end up being the same. So the two state-sponsored routes, 3CD, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, we are to some extent beholden to the budget cycle at our state house. So there's really not a mechanism to allocate funding outside of that cycle. So we're going to be looking at trying to fund step 2 and step 3 of the development process in the next transportation budget, which would be early 2025, so about this time next year. And then probably looking at digging into that same transportation budget, potentially operating budget, potentially capital budget in the following General Assembly, so 27 and 28. Which very long-winded way of saying we could have people on trains as early as late 2029, early 2030. MORPS's plan, which is not necessarily as tied to the statewide budget cycle as the two state-sponsored routes would be, just because of the magnitude of the construction that's going to be required with their plan, they're looking at the same window. And again, these are very optimistic numbers. It could end up taking a little bit longer than that. So very, very long-winded way of saying probably by the end of the decade if everything goes as planned.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that still need to go correctly, and that's part of what our advocacy efforts are about, is making sure that our elected leaders know this is important to us, that it's a worthwhile source of funding, and a lot of All Aboard Ohio's focus has been on making that business case, right? So here in the state of Ohio, it's going to be much more of a business case, business case type of decision making process, and a lot of us are advocating for passenger rail for many different decisions, and we should all continue to do that. When we're talking to our elected leaders, we want to speak the language they speak and make sure we're putting it in terms that they're going to be most receptive to.
I would also add.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
I was going to say, I would add real quick, when we look at these timelines, I want to also emphasize that the fact that we're kind of held to this budget cycle isn't necessarily going to slow the process from a planning standpoint. I mean, the step 1, step 2, step 3 of the planning process, they have a timeline that they have to work through. So, fortunately, the state budget cycle and these planning processes will line up pretty well. So it's not like we're taking longer because we have to wait for the state to fund it. It's really kind of lines up in a very natural way.
There were a couple questions that I got directly in the chat. One was, would there be an additional round of comments on the long distance rail study? And I don't think Ken's on the line this morning, so I don't know if, John, if you're aware if there's going to be another round after the next set of meetings. I would assume so.
So, traditionally, when a public comment window opens and closes, that's kind of the end of it unless something changes. So if we would have a dramatic change in how these routes are designed, I would expect for them to open up. Now, that being said, just because there's not a public window open doesn't mean that you can't advocate to FRA on the long distance portal. They do have an email address there on the portal that you can reach out and give your comments on. And I guess shame on the two of us for not mentioning those other two routes that are playing through Ohio as part of the FRA long distance route, which is a completely different bucket of funding. There's one that will go from Detroit to New Orleans with stops potentially in Toledo, Columbus, Cincinnati, and points beyond. And then there's one that goes from the Texas area through New York, and with potentially stops that would very well mirror the Midwest Connect on the western side of the state, and then 3CD on the eastern side of the state. So it kind of does a sine wave across the state and catches just about every major city in the state. So, but again, we don't have a whole lot of say in those. Those are all being planned at the federal level under a completely different funding structure.
Yeah. So when we talk about, we've got the corridor ID that's the intercity, and that's where we've been doing a lot of things, and the long distance rail study being a separate thing. Maybe one other thing to call attention to for those of us in Northeast Ohio, there were some pushes from NOACA to have the route to New Orleans perhaps come to Cleveland. And I think one point that I would make is that probably the east-west service. So the New York to Pittsburgh to St. Louis to Dallas is the one that maybe makes more sense to be sending through Cleveland, the Cleveland area, just based on rail infrastructure as it currently exists. So the other related question that was there in the chat, John, or to me anyway, was the just a question on when do the infrastructure bill funds expire at some point? So just any comments on the funding that's a part of that bill?
So they should not, and you know, just again to kind of highlight that those dollars are there. So assuming that, or I guess in the absence of Congress coming and taking them back, those are pretty well allocated and should not expire. We shouldn't have to worry about that. And in fact, you know, there is funding for additional rounds as you know, kind of people work their way through the process. So if you're, you know, again, Brian had mentioned the some of the advocacy being done by NOACA. I know they had submitted some additional routes of service. You know, we fully expect them to resubmit those in incoming rounds as well. So if you were part of a corridor that was not chosen, all is not lost. There is additional funding there.
Nathan, if you're still available, you're welcome to ask your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian and John, for the presentation. I think something that I've seen a lot online in terms of engagement around passenger rail in Ohio, a lot of questions that I've seen have surrounded the differences between the existing freight lines throughout the state and how that relates to what passenger rail would look like in implementation, or how that factors into planning. I don't know if that's too far down the path to get into, or if that's something you could provide a brief overview of maybe the differences between what freight requires, what passenger requires, and maybe how we kind of use the existing freight infrastructure to get to where we want to go.
Yeah, let me start, and then I'm going to ask
Absolutely.
John to follow up on that one. So just for starters, so we're all on the same page. And one of the things that gets for people who don't know anything about passenger rail, this can be confusing. So I just want to make sure that we're all understanding this and can answer this question. When we talk about starting a new Amtrak service, we are almost certainly talking about putting it on existing, well-maintained freight infrastructure. And that is typically where we start. And then oftentimes you need to make upgrades to that existing freight infrastructure to better support the passenger rail. As an example, it might make sense to have more passenger side or more rail sidings for trains to be able to go around each other. The sidings may need to be lengthened as freight trains have gotten longer and longer. Existing sidings weren't actually supporting what they need to do. But when we talk about starting a new service, it's an order of magnitude different to try and start passenger rail service where there isn't existing good rail infrastructure. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because that influences so many of the things. So for example, Columbus to Toledo has good freight infrastructure, so it would be, in theory, easier to add passenger rail. Whereas the east to west, when we talk about trying to connect Columbus to Pittsburgh, there's right of way, but there's not good maintained updated. So it would take a much bigger investment. So I want to level set on that. And then I'm really curious in John's additional comments to get into more of the details of Nathan's question.
So absolutely correct. And I think the presumption for all of the routes we've talked about today is that they are going to use almost exclusively existing freight routes. The only caveat to that is in high density areas, and when I mean density, I mean in terms of train traffic, there may be a potential for additional passing sidings being built, but they will almost certainly again be built on the existing right of way. That's kind of legacy from when there were much more tracks here in Ohio. So, and again, to Brian's point, when you look at the difference between, upgrading existing freight track versus, installing new track, it becomes almost prohibitively expensive. And you also open a whole lot of other doors, things like eminent domain issues, taking of people's land, which always causes some concern. And I will address, I don't know if there's anybody on the phone here from the Akron Canton area. I know that's one of the areas of the state that is very, very interested in having passenger service, and we would love to see that too. But to Brian's point, there really isn't existing freight service that goes through Akron Canton in a way that would tie it into one or the other routes. You'd almost have to go into that area and then turn around and come back, or lay this, this new passenger infrastructure. So that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's just probably not likely to happen in this kind of first round of discussion. But I would always encourage people to continue to advocate for your area to make sure that you're always part of the discussion.
Let's see. Great. Looks like Jeffrey has another question. So go ahead with that one, sir. Did I hit it? There we go. Oops.
Oh, I'm curious about how about train service to Los Angeles?
So I'm sorry, I think I walked on you.
I think we were getting an echo when you started talking.
Okay.
But basically train service to, from Ohio, getting to Los Angeles or other parts far afield.
Like
Absolutely. So as as the Amtrak network continues to become more robust, obviously we've got opportunities there that may not be there right now. So as we get tied in, as more and more of the network gets tied together, there will certainly be opportunities to travel from Ohio to particularly points west. Los Angeles, the Pacific Northwest areas through there. It may not be plain competitive, just because of the nature of our network, but it will certainly be possible.
Okay, thank you for your help, John.
Appreciate it. I did want to flag for folks, I see Glenn mentioned the TMACOG Transportation Summit later this month. I've attended these in the past. They are, great information. I don't know the intended theme of this year's presentation. Glenn, I don't know if you are aware either. I know I'm signed up to be there, but
yeah, I'm not sure either, dear John.
Okay, but they are good, and you're also, if you happen to be in the Toledo area or the TMACOG zone, Northwest Ohio, it's an opportunity to be in the same room with a lot of these policymakers and let them know that transit and transportation is very important to you.
Well, wonderful. Well, we got right through that this morning. John, any other questions? Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, I'll stick around for a few minutes in case anybody has any other
Brian,
questions. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks,
there's a group in the Patreon users that raise their hand.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's probably Youngstown Library. Go ahead.
Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Pete Milliken. I'm from Youngstown, and I think it will be great to restore rail service to Columbus, which I think has been without it for 45 years or so, along with several other major cities in the country that have no Amtrak service. I guess my question isn't directly relevant to the establishment of new service. I'm wondering what we can do to make a couple of improvements along the existing Capital Limited line that runs from Chicago to Washington. We have a stop there in a freight rail yard in Alliance. I last used Amtrak from there in 2019, so my information may not be completely up to date. But the freight yard in Alliance has no available restroom, no facilities at all, except for a shelter with a small heater in it. And Amtrak is often hours late. And so it is kind of inconvenient to have no facilities there in the middle of the night when you're waiting for a train. The other issue is I am wondering if on that existing route, we can establish a stop in Columbiana. That's an up and coming growing community. I think that would be very reasonable. I know that Amtrak likes to have stops 20 to 30 miles apart. I don't know exactly what the distance is from Alliance to Columbiana, but I think it's about 20 miles. And that would be an intermediate stop there en route to Pittsburgh. I don't know if they have any existing station or platform that they could use. But anyway, I would like to see Amtrak stop in Columbiana, because that is closer and more convenient to people in Youngstown. And I'm wondering what we can do to arrange those improvements on an existing Amtrak line.
So great question, great comments. So Ohio's at a bit of a disadvantage. There is a planning organization called the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission that basically manages FRA's Midwest Regional Rail Plan. So decisions like you're describing right now, how do we upgrade existing service? Where can we put new stops along existing routes? MIPRC is kind of the governing body that handles a lot of those, questions and concerns. Now, the good news to that, we are presently not part of MIPRC. We're one of the only states that's in the zone that is not, and we're also the one that is probably most directly affected by it because we've got so much transit coming through the state. But there is legislation that actually just got introduced this week in the Ohio State House to rejoin MIPRC. And we are working very hard at All Aboard Ohio over this weekend to get some model letters put together and maybe some instruction for advocates like yourself to reach out to our Ohio State House and just let them know that that's an important thing that we'd like to see us rejoin.
Paul, go ahead with your question.
I'm sorry, did you call on?
That's a
Yes,
lot of
go ahead,
hit
Paul.
up the hold.
Hello?
I guess you better start from lots of crybaby, how about?
Yeah, Paul, go ahead. I'm not sure what the other was, but we can get to that next.
The appointments to the Surface Transportation Board passenger advisory panel came out last week, and Jim Matthews was named to it from NARP essentially. Just wondered exactly what kind of impact that's going to have on our advocacy, and I'm sure it's not a bad thing. How much of a good thing it is? Just any comment on that?
Yeah, it's, this is a fairly new program, and we've got a lot of familiar faces on that list. I'm actually, my day job is in the labor realm, so I'm most familiar with Greg Regan, the head of AFL-CIO's TTD department, who was also appointed to the board. So I'm very optimistic. Anytime that you can get people that are, smarter than me in a room together to advocate for something, I think we're going to be in good shape. So I'm optimistic that it's going to help our cause and at least help keep driving programs like Corridor ID and the long distance study program to continue funding and continue looking for new opportunities.
Yeah, I noticed that none of the retired railroaders or general consumers made it to the final. So maybe sometime in the future, one of us can get on.
Jeffrey, go ahead with your question.
Unmoved. How about like Columbus to New York? Because I have a lot of family there, just like I do in LA and San Francisco.
So if 3CD were to come online, you would have the opportunity to take a train from Columbus to the Cleveland area and then pick up the Lakeshore Limited and take it on into New York. So that's probably the easiest lift for you. And that's, again, why we're so excited about rejoining MIPRC is we'd have an opportunity to really advocate for the timing of some of these east-west long-distance routes to more appropriately match up with our state-sponsored rails so that when you get to Cleveland, you're not having to spend the night there to get the train the next day. We really want everything to kind of line up so that it's very usable, not only within the state, but also beyond the state as well.
Mm-hmm. And then the other future planning path there is that one of the proposed routes is essentially a Columbus eastbound to New York City. So Columbus to Pittsburgh to Philadelphia to New York City is one of the proposed long distance routes. So that's also something that's got at least some initial planning for. That's the same service that would go to the west through Cincinnati, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and then on down to Dallas, actually closely following the path of last week's eclipse. So kind of an interesting connection there. Good.
Great questions.
Yeah, lot of wonderful questions. So I think we got to all the questions that were in the chat. So certainly we appreciate everyone's time this morning. Thank you very much. Hopefully you found it interesting and useful. Once we get a chance to kind of get this recording established, we do post these on the webpage a few days after the meeting. So if anybody was interested in this and didn't get a chance to join us, they would have a chance to view the recording of this and kind of take in the questions as well. So I don't see any other questions. I think that concludes our meeting this morning. Thank you very much. I hope to see some of you in Northeast Ohio next weekend. And of course that the other chapter meetings around the state, and we look forward to make sure, I'm sure we'll get a blog post out of the group that's going from Cincinnati to Chicago and back. Mitch has been doing a lot of nice postings on social media with some of his experiences so far as we continue to advocate for more passenger rail here in Ohio. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. Have a great rest of the weekend.
I'll hang out too, Brian, in case anybody has any last minute thoughts or questions.
Yeah. I will stop the recording here.